おはようございます。今日も朝のフーディニ作業配信をやっていきたいと思います。今週は結構ベラムを作業して、ベラムのチュートリアルを中心に作っていたので、今日はフーディニの公式で再生リストのファンウィズベラムというベラムの動画10本ぐらいあるんですけど、これでベラムでできることがざっと見れるので、これをダラダラと2時間ぐらいですかね。ダラダラと見るのを中心にやっていこうかなと思ってます。なので、何か作るってよりは裏側で勝手に手を動かしているので、動画を見る感じですね、通して。はい、では、動画今入ってなかったな。はい、この動画ですね。裏ではいつも通り風に立ち上げて手を動かしているので、はい、じゃあ動画流していきます。
It's Houdini time. Let's check out another node. Vellum Cloth. Cloth is super fun to play with in Houdini. There are many fun things you can do with it. Let's quickly walk through the basics of setting up a cloth simulation. Drop down a grid. Let's reduce the scale because Houdini is working in meters. Unless you're having a family picnic, 10 by 10 meters is a bit big for a cloth simulation. We also want to change the rows and columns to 2 by 2. This helps get a better result from the remesh node. Let's add a remesh. This gives some nice triangles which often results in nicer folds and wrinkles without giving any artifacts. Add a UV project. Although we won't do any rendering, it's a great habit to get into. There's nothing more frustrating getting to the end of a long simulation only to realize you forgot to add UVs. In the UV project, go to the Initialize tab and click Initialize. Drop a Vellum Cloth node. For now, let's leave everything at default. Add a Vellum Solver. We'll add 4 substeps. I usually find myself using 4 substeps as a default. Add a sphere and change it from primitive to polygon. Let's reduce the scale so that it's
微妙だな。上げようかな。
smaller than our grid and place it under our grid. We also want to give it a few more subdivisions to smooth it out. Wire this into the third input of the Vellum Solver. This is where you can wire in your colliders.
難しい。グリッドを作って、リメッシュ入れて、プロジェクト、クイックシェード作った。で、ベラムクロスね。それはスフィア。3ステップを上げて、こいつを上げればいいのかな。適当に。 適当に。これどうやろうかな。まあいいか。
Now hit play. Another thing we can do is to pin the edges. Let's add a group node, set it to points, and disable base group and enable keep in bounding regions. Now we can move
基本はクロスシミュレーションをでコリジョンセットするだけってことだよな。で、それは放水重力かかってて落ちるから、例えばちょっとフォーカスとかしてみると、重力が強すぎてあんま変わらない。ちょっとずれたか。なるほど。シミュレーションずっとかかり続けるのか。なるほどね。しかし重いなぁ。ベラムのシミュレーションは。で、
move this box around and it'll create a point group of whatever's within that box. In our Vellum Cloth node, let's add this group to our pinpoint section. We can also add wind to give our cloth some nice
グループ作って、リングボックス入れて、
dynamics. Dive inside the Vellum Solver and add a pop wind. In my example, I gave it a negative 0.6 in the Z wind velocity, and I gave it a little bit of noise and reduced the swirl size. Let's take a look at the Vellum Cloth node and what those parameters do and how you can change the look of your simulations. Stretch stiffness. This value is how much each polygon is allowed to stretch and grow. A really high number like the default 10e plus 10 means
ベラムクロスのストレッチは、
means don't stretch me, leave me be. A low number like 1 means I'm free, and it's allowed to stretch a lot, usually way too much. However, you can get some really fun results by lowering the stiffness that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get. Bend stiffness. This is the amount each polygon can bend on its own axis. A lower amount means more bends. A higher number like 0.1 or 1 means don't bend me. Rest length. When this is set to 1, it maintains the current distance between points. If you turn it to a higher number, it'll increase the constraint distance, so you'll make your cloth bigger or smaller depending on this number. You can also use a float attribute such as attribute paint.
なるほど。クロスベンドとストレッチとベンドのパラメータがあって、ストレッチとベンドのパラメータがあって、ちょっと消してた。構成で、ストレッチのスティフネスを下げると、なんか思ってたのと違うぞ。100に1とかにしてみるか。なるほどね。で、最初10なんだ。そんな高かったんだ、これ。で、ベンドのスティフネスを逆に上げると、こうして、こういう感じのパラメータにすると、伸びるだけみたいな感じのことができる。レングススケールは、何これ。 え、どういうこと？広がってくる。ストリングススケール。デフォルトとかにするとそういうことか。そうか。クロス用にセットアップされているから。クロスはめちゃめちゃ細かいんだ。
To paint the
なるほど。
areas you want a higher rest length, which I use all the time. The cloth node is obviously not limited to actual cloth only. You can also use this on geometry to get some nice clothy behavior. Let's jump back into our project and take a look at how we can set up this attribute paint. For this example, we'll remove gravity, but we'll add 2 in the Y wind field. Let's remove our sphere. Let's add a group swap and change it to points. Uncheck the base group and check include by edges and select unshared edges. In our Vellum Cloth pin to animation, let's pin this group. Let's add an attribute paint on our constraint geometry. This is where rest length is stored and where we can manipulate it. Paint some areas you want to affect. This paints a value of 1 and everything else remains 0. We'll use an attribute promote to promote this point attribute to a primitive attribute. Add a primitive wrangle. We're now going to use a simple expression to apply the mask attribute to affect rest length. We'll start off by writing f at rest length equals f at rest length orig. This is just telling Vellum to use the original rest length. Now we'll multiply it by our masked attribute. This will create values that are 0 and others that are the original unchanging rest length. We don't want values that are 0 as this will break. So we'll use a fit01 function to help us out. Fit01 expects a 0 to 1 range, which we have from at mask. Perfect. We then remap 0 to 1 to 1 to 2. Perfect, that's exactly what we want. After the Vellum Solver, let's add a Vellum post-process. This allows you to smooth and subdivide your mesh. I find the loop subdivision works really nicely with triangles. In my pig head example, I wanted to add gravity so certain parts flop down. However, I didn't want the whole pig to flop down, so you can use an attribute paint to both. Both affect rest length and pin groups. Paint the parts you want to affect, then drop down an attribute wrangle. We'll use a simple expression that creates groups based on an attribute. Now we just need to transfer our attribute from the geo stream to the constraint stream, and the rest remains the same as before. Cloth has so many fun uses. You can stream, and the rest attribute. Now we just need to transfer. Attribute from the geo stream to the constraint stream. And the rest remains the same as before. Cloth has so many fun uses. You can change just a few parameters to get incredible results. So why don't you jump in and try it out? It's Houdini time. I love using this node. Let's check it out. Vellum Balloon. Vellum Balloon is amazing. It lets you quickly create really pleasing soft body simulations. I use this all the time in my projects. Let's take a look at how to create a basic Vellum soft body using Vellum Balloon. First, drop down a sphere. We need to change it from primitive to polygon. Let's reduce the scale to 0.1. We can give it a few more subdivisions. Let's go with 6 for now. Drop down a Vellum Balloon. Add a Vellum Solver. Let's jump to 4 substeps. I find this is a good starting point for most simulations. We can also add a ground plane as a collider with a single click. Winner. But now our sphere is intersecting the floor, so let's go back and move our sphere up by 0.5. Let's hit play. Let's take a look at some of the parameters of the Vellum Balloon and how we can manipulate them to get the simulation that we want. Vellum Balloon is made up of a Vellum Cloth constraint and a Vellum pressure constraint. As we looked at before, the stretch stiffness in the cloth constraint is how much polygons can stretch. This is important to remember when dealing with soft bodies. When we have a high stretch stiffness, it creates
回ちゃんと。
Primitive to polygon. Let's reduce the scale to 0.1. We can give it a few more subdivisions. Let's go with 6 for now. Drop down a vellum balloon, add a vellum solver. Let's jump to 4 substeps.
作るとそれ
I found this is a good starting point for most simulations. We can also add a ground plane as a collider with a single click. Winner. But now our sphere is intersecting the floor, so let's go back and move our sphere up by 0.5. Let's hit play. Let's take a look at some of the parameters of the vellum balloon.
全部見てたら3時間ぐらいかかりそうだ。早すぎ。で、このパラメータがこっちだ。クロスストレッチスティフネス、ベンドスティフネス、ストレッチ、ベンド、プレッシャー。プレッシャーがこっちか。コンストレートのプレッシャー。クロスで、ストレッチとベンドを。で、プレッシャーのストレッチを上げると、形状が維持されていると。 プレッシャーのスティフネスが割と低めなのか。で、これはだからデフォルトか。これがデフォルトのシミュレーション結果。で、クロスのスティフネスを、そのスティフネスだけを上げると、動画みたいに横に並べてみるのがいいんだろうな。ベンドか。ベンドのスティフネスに関係してくるか。これが高いと、結構分かりにくいな。なるほど。これがデフォルトか。0.1 の1。でね。高くすると、これはいまいちわからんな、パラメーターが。
How we can manipulate them to get the simulation that we want. Vellum balloon is made up of a vellum cloth constraint and a vellum pressure constraint. As we looked at before, the stretch stiffness in the cloth constraint is how much polygons can stretch. This is important to remember when dealing with soft bodies. When we have a high stretch stiffness, it creates a very stiff soft body. Lowering the setting can get you some nice jello. Cloth stretch stiffness and pressure stretch stiffness play hand in hand. You often have to go back and forth adjusting them to allow them to play nicely together. You can also add some bend stiffness into the mix to get some more bendy type soft bodies. You may find that your simulations get a lot of jitter or just never really settle down. You can adjust the damping ratio in the cloth stretch section. Increasing this value reduces the energy
ダンピングレーションか なるほど。そういうことか。
Vellum is using to try and evaluate the constraints. So what can we do with Vellum Balloon? Let's take a look at two projects. This project is going to be about how to create some spheres that are attracted to a center point with some nice squishy soft body behavior. Let's start by creating a sphere. The sphere is a little bit large, so we'll just reduce the scale, and then we need to change it from a primitive to a polygon, and we'll give it some more subdivisions. Let's drop down a VDB from polygon. This lets us create a fog volume, which fills our sphere with a fog. This is great for when we need to scatter some points, and we don't want them just to scatter on the surface of the geometry, but rather to fill the geometry with points, like we have here. We don't need 1,000 points, we just want something like 17. On the other side, let's create another sphere. Here again, we'll change it to polygon, we'll give it a few more subdivisions, and we'll reduce the scale to something like 0.1. We'll use a copy to points to copy each sphere onto the points. At the moment, we have a uniform scale on each point. We want to change this so we can use an attribute randomize on our points, and we'll change the CD to P scale and give it something like 0.4 and 1. So now we have some small values and some big values. Great. Let's drop down a Vellum balloon. As you saw in the previous part of this tutorial, depending on what values you use, you can get very different results. For this test, I'm going to use something like 10,000 in the stretch stiffness and 0.001 in the bend stiffness. In our pressure stiffness, we're going to use 10e plus 10. Very nice, full of pressure. Let's drop down a Vellum Solver. We'll give it some substeps and remove gravity. Let's dive inside. Let's add a pop attract. This node is great. It lets you attract particles or points towards a certain position or point. In this case, we're going to just attract it to the world 0. So if we look at our grid, we can see that there is 0 and all our points are going to be attracted to that position. If we hit play, we get this nice squishy bouncing behavior. You can make it more squishy or less squishy by giving it less pressure and less stretch stiffness. But for now, let's add a Vellum post process. And this allows us to quite easily add a little bit of facial blur as well as subdivisions. I like to use loop subdivisions on triangles. Something that's great to do is to use this extrude by thickness. This just fills it in a little bit so that the gap where the subdivision has shrunk it now fills it nicely again. The second project is something that I use all the time, inflation. When it comes to Vellum Balloon, you get some really fun results by increasing the pressure's rest length. Let's walk through how to set that up. I started with a grid and scattered some points. I used the basic attribute randomize to randomize the p-scale. I then created a sphere and placed it on top of the floor with a match size. I then picked a point on the bottom to create a group, and then later I will pin this group in Vellum. I then copied the spheres to the points with a copy to point. I used a Vellum balloon to create the soft bodies. I used a stretch stiffness of 1000, a bend stiffness of 0.001, and a stretch stiffness of 1 million. Notice I've checked output group and renamed it to p-stretch. We'll use this soon. I then add a Vellum Solver. Again, let's jump to 4 sub-steps. Now I can increase the rest length on the pressure node, but this will only be calculated on frame 1 and will not be a constant adding of pressure, but rather on frame 2 it'll jump to the new size. If this is what you're after, you're done. If you want to slowly inflate them, let's set that up. Let's dive inside the Vellum Solver. Add a Vellum Constraint. This will only be calculated on frame 1 and will not be a constant adding of pressure, but rather on frame 2 it'll jump to the new size. If this is what you're after, you're done. If you want to slowly inflate them, let's set that up. Let's dive inside the Vellum Solver. Add a Vellum Constraint property. This lets you update all the settings we've looked at before, but we can increase or decrease them over time. For now, I set the group to the p-stretch group we created, so we're only affecting pressure. I then keyframe the rest length scale from 1 to 30 over 60 frames. What I sometimes like to do is add another Vellum Constraint property to affect the stretch stiffness and rest length. It gives some really nice results. You can also time offset the animations, unpin them, and have them interact with the collider. The options are endless. Vellum Balloon is definitely one of my favorite tools to play with in Houdini, so why don't you give it a chance? Jump in, try it out. It's Houdini time. It's time for another node. Let's check it out. Vellum Hair. Vellum Hair is really versatile and can be used in many situations to get amazing results. Let's set up some basic hair and dig into some of the key features. First, we're going to create a line. Now this line only has 2 points, as we can see here, but we need a few more points. Let's go with something like 10 for now. So we have a slightly more high-res line. Now, we also want to scatter these points across a grid. So we can create a grid. This grid is a little bit big for now, so we'll reduce the scale to something like 2 times 2. Now we have a grid that is 2 meters by 2 meters. We're going to scatter some points, and we don't want 1,000 points. We'll just drop this down to something like 500. We can use a copy to points node to copy our lines onto these points. Great, so now we have some hairs, and each line has 10 segments. Perfect. What we want next is we want to create a group that we can pin the bottom point so that when we run our simulation, these hairs don't just fly away. So we can use a handy group expression. This just allows us to create groups based on certain expressions, and there's a drop down with some cool presets. So we're going to use this first point from primitive, and we need to change this to a point group, and we'll relabel this as something like root. And so now we have a list of points that are the root position, and we've
そんなプリセットがあるんだ。グループエクスプレッション。
access to a cool plus to create groups based on certain expressions, and there's a drop.
全然そんなに見えぞ。どういうことだこれ。自分で作ってるってこと？おかしいな。これは自分で作ってんのか。そうだ。
Down with some cool presets. So we're going to use this first point from primitive, and we need to change this to
とプリミティブで1個目のプリミティブの最初の頂点を選ぶってことか。ポイントにすると、めっちゃ便利じゃん、これ。一発で1個目選べるんだ。
And we'll relabel this as something like root. And so now we have a list of points that
これは便利だな。アウト X プリムインデックス0。X プリムインデックスの0番の VTX ナンバー。こういうエクスプレッション初めて見るな。
that are the root position, and we've stored them in this group. We can add a Vellum here, and all we're going to do now is add the group that we just created, this root, into the Vellum here. And if we look at this, now we can see that these points are all pinned to the ground. We can now add a Vellum Solver, and we're going to jump it up to 4. Now add a Vellum Solver. Now we can see the group that we just created, this root, into the Vellum here. And if we look at this, now we can see that these points are all pinned to the ground. We can now add a Vellum Solver, and we're going to jump it up to 4 sub-steps. We want to dive inside and we want to add a pop wind. Pop wind is great for adding just some realistic, natural, organic type wind, and we're just going to add some noise. We're not going to actually use any wind right now, but just a noise field to drive our hairs around. If we dive back out, and we can use a camera, let's turn off the base grid and let's hit play and see what happens. Obviously, this is not what we want. Let's look at how we can get some more control over our simulation. For easier visualization purposes, after my Vellum Solver, I've added a clean node. This allows me to remove all the attributes and groups coming out of Vellum. This just helps keep things cleaner as we move forward. I then add a resample to get more points on. After my Vellum Solver, I've added a clean node. This allows me to remove all the attributes and groups coming out of Vellum. This just helps keep things cleaner as we move forward. I then add a
使ってない頂点を消しただけか。
resample to get more points onto my line, so when I sweep them I'm not getting such low res geometry. I also check subdivision curves to smooth out my lines. Lastly, add a sweep set to round tube and a radius of 0.03 for now. I've increased the Vellum hair's thickness to 0.5 to prevent intersections. We'll talk about this in a minute. Back to the Vellum settings. If we keep gravity checked on, something we can do is alter our bend stiffness. This will prevent the hairs from being able to bend and fall over themselves. Let's jump to a higher value such as 3 times 0.01. Now we get some nice grass-like behavior without our hairs collapsing. If we want some really nice seaweedy type bends or behavior, we can lower our bend stiffness to 5 times 0.0001 and turn off gravity. You can lower the bend stiffness even more to get some chaotic yet stable results. Let's jump back up to 3 times 0.01 and turn gravity back on. Hair thickness is very useful. You can visualize the hair thickness by checking this box while you have the hair node selected. The default is perfect for thin hair, but when we start sweeping thicker profiles, it's good to increase this value. This is the size Vellum is using to collide hairs with each other. Let's lower this and keep our sweep settings the same. Notice now how we get a lot of intersections. If we increase the hair thickness, the hair repels against each other and keeps a far distance apart from one another. Vellum stretch stiffness is the amount each constraint is allowed to stretch or grow. I've set up another example where I have a net and a pig head, and the pig head is falling down. If the stretch stiffness is at default, we don't get much stretching. However, if we lower this significantly to 0.01, we get a nice stretchy net. It's often a lot of fun to combine different Vellum constraint types like Vellum hair and Vellum balloon. Let's look at how I've set that up. I started with a grid and I made it 5 by 5 and gave it 50 times 50 subdivisions. I then created a point group and set it to unshared edges. I used the end stop to convert my polygons into curves. I then used the Vellum hair. I created a pig head, subdivided it, and then remeshed it so I had a nice low-res geometry for faster iterations. I then attached a Vellum balloon. I lowered the mass to something similar of that of the Vellum hair so that my pig head was not 100 times heavier than my hairs. I left the rest of the settings as default. I then merged the geo and the constraints separately and fed those into the Vellum Solver. I used 8 substeps for this to get more accurate calculations between the objects. The last thing I want to touch on is rest length. This allows you to grow hairs. This is super useful if you need to create hair but you need to guide it around an object. You can start with really short hair and then grow it with rest length so it interacts with colliders. In this setup, I started with the original setup, but I make the line value 0.2 so it's much shorter. I then add 30 segments so when it grows it has enough segments to interact with our collider. I then added a subdivided torus as a collider object which goes into the third input of Vellum. I removed gravity and added an upward wind of 3 in the y direction, and I reduced the amplitude of the noise. Now we get hairs that are long, but they're not intersecting with our geometry. You can do some super fun stuff with Vellum hair. Check out the attached HIP file where I've included a couple additional examples. Dig in, it's Houdini time. It's Houdini time! Let's jump in. Vellum Glue. Vellum Glue is a very useful Vellum add-on node. It searches nearby points that are not a member of its own piece of geometry. It then creates a constraint between those points. Let's take a look at how we can use Vellum Glue to attach hairs to a Vellum balloon simulation. In this scene, I have a camera setup which I'm looking through and I have an empty geo container.
Vellum Glue 新しいのが出てきたな。
We're going to dive inside and we're going to create a torus. This is going to be our balloon shape, and so we can reduce the scale maybe by 0.3 or 4. And then we just want to rotate it just so we have a slightly better angle of view. Something like this is fine, and maybe we'll move it down just a little bit. And we can turn off this grid. We're then going to use a subdivide to subdivide it to give it a few more subdivisions. For now, we'll keep it something low poly so that we can iterate more quickly. We'll then create a group node. We're going to set it to points. And this group is going to be called cloth. We'll use this group later. We can then configure a Vellum balloon. And we're also going to use another Vellum Constraint, and this is going to be set to pin to target. In the cloth settings, let's update the bend stiffness to be something like 0.001, so it's a little bit more wobbly. In the pressure settings, let's change this to 10,000, and we're going to give it a rest length scale of 4, so it should expand quite a bit. And because we've lowered the bend stiffness, we get some nice wobble. I'm going to use this pin to target set to soft with match animation. I like to use this when I want to keep my object centered to where it originally started, but also to have the vellum property so that it doesn't fly off of the screen. And I'm going to set this to 1. Coming back up to the torus, we're going to drop down a new stream, and first we're going to give it some normals. So we can see now we have these normals that are pointing out, and we need to change it to point normals. So we have these point normals pointing out, and we're going to now attach our hairs to the torus. So let's create a line, and our line we can make it something a little bit smaller, like 0.25, and give it a lot more subdivisions, like 15. This also needs to point along the z-axis, so when we plug it in, now we get a whole bunch of hairs. Perfect. What we want to do next is we want to create a group on the base point. So we can use a group expression. This is handy because it has presets. Here we can use the first point of primitive, and if we set this to the point group, we can relabel this root, and now we have the first point of each of our lines set in this root group. We can then create a group node, and we can call this hair. Turn this into a point group as well. This is just handy to have if post-sim we want to separate the hair from the soft body. We can then create our vellum hair. And for now, we can leave all the settings as default. We're now going to drop down 2 merge nodes, and we're going to combine the geo streams and the constraint streams separately. We can then plug these into a Vellum Glue so that we have both the hairs and the geometry coming in. For the Vellum Glue, all we're going to do is we're going to change this to point groups, and we're going to choose that root group. So now these root groups are the points that need to attach themselves to the soft body simulation. Let's drop down a Vellum Solver. We're going to jump up to 4 substeps, remove gravity, and we're going to dive inside. We're going to add a pop wind. And with this pop wind, we're just going to add a little bit of noise, maybe something like 0.5. And we're only going to affect the group that is the cloth. And the reason is that we don't want the hairs to be blown by the wind, but rather just to react to the movement of the soft body. You can turn this off and see which one you prefer. So now when we hit play, this is what we get. Let's take a look at some of the Vellum Glue constraint settings. The stretch stiffness is how much each of these constraints can grow. If we lower this value to 0.1, the constraint is allowed to grow a lot, but then it tries to maintain its original distance, so it shrinks back down. There's also the detach point chance. This is useful if you want some random hairs to fly away and not to be glued down. Vellum Glue also has a breaking threshold that can be animated in a variety of ways that will break or release this constraint. Vellum Glue can be used on cloth pieces as well. Let's take a look at the setup. I started with the grid, I set it to the XY plane, and I made it smaller and reduced the rows and columns to 2. I then remeshed it to a nice high-res mesh. I used the copy transform to create a second flipped copy. I then add an attribute noise, and I set the attribute name to break threshold scale. If we jump ahead to the glue constraint, you can see in the breaking section, we can scale our breaking value by an attribute. So the attribute noise will create some sections that are harder to break and others that break easily. After the attribute noise, I create a group of just the topmost points. I then use a transform on this group, and I scale these points outwards. I create a Vellum cloth, and I change to set uniform with a very low mass. I used a pin to target set to my animated top edge, and then I check match animation. I then use the glue constraint. I use the default settings except for adding the breaking threshold. I then add a Vellum Solver with 4 substeps. I wanted to quickly go over another setup file that is included, as it approaches the Vellum setup slightly differently, so let's take a look at how I set that up. I first needed to create some Vellum balloon pillars. I did that with simple modeling techniques. I used a Vellum balloon with very stiff bend and pressure constraints. I then wanted to create spheres that I'd throw at the pillars. I did this with a simple sphere. Again, I used a Vellum balloon. I increased the bend stiffness and the pressure stiffness quite a lot so they were more stiff and retained pressure. I then wanted random points to emit the spheres from, so I created a sphere and I clipped it to get only a quarter of the sphere. In my scatter, I used a small expression to emit 1 point every 8 frames. I then also added an expression to the global seed so it would randomize the seed, thus changing the position of the point each time it emits. I added reference nulls after each of my streams so that I could easily reference them inside of DOPs. I then used a DOPnet. I find when doing more complicated setups, it's easier to set up a Vellum Solver inside a DOPnet as it's easier to customize. It's a really simple setup, but let's walk through it. I have 2 Vellum source nodes. The first is bringing in my tubes. There are only emitting ones. I then have another Vellum source bringing in my spheres, but notice I've changed the emission type to instance on points. I then add a reference to the points I set up. I use a pop attract on the spheres only so they are pulled into the center. I then use a Vellum Glue. The only thing I change is to create constraints to each frame so it is updating every frame. I then use a Vellum Solver and a Vellum object as they're required by Vellum to work. Glue is super fun constraint to play with. It opens up so many possibilities. So jump in, play around. It's Houdini time. Here's another node I love to use. Let's jump into Houdini and check it out. Pin to target. I use this node all the time as it has so many use cases. Let's take a look at some of them. The permanent mode fixes points to the position you specify. It doesn't allow the constraint to grow or shrink, but it keeps it fixed rigidly. You can also have the pin group animated, which is useful. The soft constraint allows you to change how rigid you want your constraint to be. You can have it be permanently pinned, or you can adjust it so that it is more influenced by Vellum. The stop constraint allows you to release these constraints inside DOPs with attributes. Let's take a look at some of these setups. Let's take a look at how to set up a soft constraint. We're going to start with a sphere and we need to change this to polygon. We'll reduce the scale to something like 0.5 and turn up the frequency to 10. We're then going to use a mountaintop to give our sphere some shape. We'll also use this mountaintop to give our sphere animated noise so that we can showcase how the soft constraint works. For now, let's animate the height property from 0 to 2 over 15 frames. We can also reduce the element scale to something like 0.3. Let's use a small expression to constantly offset our noise. We'll use something like $frame, which is taking our frame number, and we're going to multiply it by 0.01 to slow it down. Now we have a constantly moving noise through our sphere. Let's use a subdivide to give our shape more subdivisions. We're going to use loop so that we keep our triangles. Now we can drop down a Vellum Cloth. And in these cloth settings, I'm going to use set uniform and I'm going to change the mass to 0.01. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to change the stretch stiffness to 100 and I'm going to change the bend stiffness to 1 lower. Let's drop another Vellum Constraint, and this is going to be our pin to target. So at the top we can change this to pin to target. Because I want to pin my whole shape and not a specific group, I can just leave this empty. Let's change this to soft with match animation checked on, and let's change this down to 1. We'll go through these settings in a little bit. Next we need a Vellum Solver. We'll jump up to 4 sub-steps, and we're going to remove gravity. Let's dive inside, and let's add a little bit of pop wind. I always find that this gives just a nice organic movement to whatever simulation I'm doing. We can add a value of 2 along the x-axis and 1 in the noise field. We can also add a Vellum post-process after our solver. This just allows us to give some more subdivisions. I'll set it to loop mode, and we can also give a slight spatial blur. Let's hit play and see what we get. The soft constraint has a stretch stiffness parameter, which is how permanent versus how much vellum you want your constraint to be. A value of 10e plus 10 is 100% permanent, so it'll match the incoming animation and have no vellum influence. A value of 1 is a mix between your incoming animation and your vellum sim properties. Anything below 1 is now removing the pin constraint and making it more like vellum. You can also set up an attribute pre-vellum to scale the stretch stiffness bar. This is really useful in the pin to target, as you can paint areas that you want to be more pinned and other areas that you want to be more vellum. You can also set the constraints to be stopped. This sets a permanent and pin type, but allows you to release these pins inside your solver. This is a very useful constraint type. Let's take a look at setting up the stopped attribute and how we can control this inside our solver. I started with the line and I made it a length of 0.3 and I gave it 5 subdivisions. I then used a sweep, set it to round tube, and I increased the radius, and I added an end cap set to grid. I then subdivided to smooth it out. I added some point normals. I then scattered some points. I then added a line set to the Z direction, 0.12 in length, and I added 8 points. I then used a copy to points to attach each line to the capsuled points. I then used a group expression in point mode set to first point of primitive to set the root group of the first point on each line. I dropped down a vellum hair and I just lowered the bend stiffness slightly. I added a pin to target constraint. I selected my root group and set it to stopped. I then created a Vellum Solver. I added 4 substeps and removed gravity. In order to release the pins, I wanted a gradient so they didn't all release at the same time. So I used a MOPS shape falloff to get a 0 to 1 attribute going through my geometry. MOPS is not included in Houdini, but it is a free add-on toolkit. I find it really useful, but you can use any sort of method you'd like to get a 0 to 1 gradient. Let's dive inside the Vellum Solver and see how I brought in this attribute. I used a pop wrangle and I selected my root group. In the Inputs tab, I referenced the null I had created after my MOPS falloff. In the code section, I first bring in my MOPS attribute with a point function. I then use the MOPS variable to update the stopped attribute. So now, as MOPS falloff changes the value from 1 to 0, it unpins the points. So as you can see, pin to target has so many cool uses and functions depending on how you want to use it. So why don't you check out the provided HIP file, change some of the settings, and let's see what you can come up with. It's Houdini time. This Vellum node is super powerful.
はあ、いいな、めちゃめちゃ。一応丁寧だったけど、だいぶ早くなってきたな。これは10まであるのか。ちょっと一回この辺にしておこうかな。ベラムでできることが分かってきたと。はい、一旦今日の配信はここまでにします。ちょっとなんか適当に作って後であげようかなと思います。はい、ご視聴ありがとうございました。